So today I wanted to talk about something that has puzzled me for a while, which is from Parshat Ba'alotecha, and is an episode towards the end, this famous one where Miriam speaks to Aaron about Moshe and then becomes Mitzorat. So she has this snowy affliction on her skin, and this is associated somehow with a mistake she made in the way that she was speaking. And the question is, what did she say and what was wrong about it? Or how is this related to other subjects going on in the rest of that parasha, that region of the Torah? So I'll start with just the source for that particular piece of the story. ותדבר מרים ואהרון במשה על אודות האישה הכושית אשר לקח כי אישה חושית לקח. Miriam and Aaron spoke against Moshe or about Moshe regarding the matter of the Cushite woman that he took, for he had taken a Cushite woman. And then we have an elaboration of what it is that was said. It says, "Vayomeru harak ach b'Moshe diber Adonai, halo gam banu diber v'yishma Adonai." And they said, "Has the Lord indeed spoken only by Moses? Has he not also spoken by us?" And Hashem heard. So the idea is they're seemingly raising the question of whether Moshe's nivuah, Moshe's prophecy, or his ability to speak on behalf of HaKadosh Baruch Hu is unique or not. And we see that because the text elaborates on that subject. When HaKadosh Baruch Hu weighs in, it's all about how Moshe is unique, that Moshe speaks pe el pe or panim el panim with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, but no one else is like that. And so it is about somehow the nature of prophecy, the nature of nivuah, and the uniqueness of Moshe's nivuah. And that actually is a larger theme in this whole section of the Torah in Sefer Bamidbar, because what else happens in Parshat Ba'alotecha? You have Eldad and Medad who are prophesying in the camp. And why are they prophesying in the camp? Because when Moshe is at his wit's end and he's asking HaKadosh Baruch Hu to help him, the Ruach of Hashem is given to the other members of the tribe, the 70 elders, and some of the Ruach seems to rest on Eldad and Medad, and they're prophesying. And in addition, you also have the general theme of an attempt by the nation to get something more from HaKadosh Baruch Hu than what they're getting. They're complaining about the man. They're saying they want meat. But if you go back to when it was that they were actually demanding, or whether when they got the man in the first place, is because they were demanding to know that Hashem was in their midst. So it was kind of like a national outcry for contact. It wasn't food per se. They were already getting food. They had the date palms that they found, but they wanted some kind of guarantee of Hashem's imminence and presence. And so the whole theme with all the stuff with food and also with Eldad and Medad and the resting of the Ruach of Hashem on more of Bnei Israel, and this discussion of Miriam and Aaron about whether Moshe's nivuah is unique. It's a strong theme running all the way through most of Parshat Ba'alotecha, and yet I think it's still easy to kind of read these things as separate fragments because it's hard to string them together to see how they're related. Like, what does the story of Eldad and Medad, for example, have to do with what Miriam is talking about? Does it have anything to do with it? Because a priori, other than the fact that it so happens to be that we have more than one instance where someone's talking about nivuah and the possibility of can others be Nevi'im, like, when Eldad and Medad start prophesying, Yehoshua ben Nun asks Moshe whether we should lock them up, and Moshe says, "Me, 10, if only one would give all that this whole nation would be prophets." So the general theme is maybe more people besides Moshe can be Nevi'im, but then suddenly when Miriam is saying, look, we are Nevi'im. She's Miriam HaNevi'ah, according to the Torah, and Aaron also is sometimes speaking for Hashem. So she's just stating a fact, but there's some kind of problem in what she's talking about here. And it seems like it can't be that she's stating the fact. It has to be something else that she's raising. And the other thing that she's raising is the Isha Kushit. And that indeed is the puzzling aspect of that passage. What Isha Kushit? What woman are we talking about? Did Moshe take a new wife? Or is this talking about Tzipporah? And if so, then why is she called Kushit? Because she's from Midian. She's a Midianite. She's not a Kushit, seemingly. And so it's a very puzzling passage in that sense. And also, what does the wife of Moshe have to do with prophecy, right? Like if the subject is we're Nevi'im like Moshe, right? And if the whole subject of the parasha is somehow about the nature of prophecy, then what does it matter the person that Moshe is married to? What does that have to do with the current topic? And also, in some sense, you could ask as well, why would that be a problem for her? I mean, it doesn't say that Miriam said or Aaron said something bad about Moshe's wife. It just said that it was about the matter of the woman he married somehow. And of course, the Torah is often very reluctant to give us details. And so you could say maybe the details were that there was something negative. But we still have to ask why it gives us these details. I mean, is it an important detail to say that she's a Cushite? If it isn't important to say that Miriam said something bad about her, unless the bad thing is that she's a Cushite, in which case, why? So, we have all these questions swirling around here. And I think there's no question as well that a topic like this or a puzzle like this is going to be resolved more than one way and more than one correct way or acceptable way, informative way. So anything that I say doesn't mean to exclude other possibilities. But I think there is a way of reading this, as it turns out, where there seems to be a lot of evidence that piles up, that it's one way that the Torah wants us to look at it. And I think in this reading, we're going to say that the Cushite woman in question is Tzipporah, the daughter of Reuel, or the daughter, in any case, of Kohen Midian, the high priest of Midian. There's a whole other set of confusions you could create about Reuel and Chovav ben Reuel and Yitro, and whether they're the same person or whether they're different people. So I don't want to get into that. But in any case, Moshe married a Midianite woman. And now the question is, what does that have to do with Cush? So I think, strangely enough, the hint of this comes from Eldad and Medad, because these are two other people who have prophecy, and their names happen to have this similar dad at the end of them. And that's the thread we're going to pull on, where we're going to suddenly say, oh, actually, this reveals to us some pieces that fit together and start revealing to us, different things are connected, and we can explain some things. Before I get into that, though, I just want to make a basic observation, which is that in this passage in Parashat Beha'alotecha, when Miriam and Aaron are speaking about Moshe and about the Cushite woman that he's married to, one of the things you can't help but notice there is that this is a family discussion, right? Miriam and Aaron are what? They are the brother and sister of Moshe. They are Hebrews from Shevet Levi, and they're both married to other Hebrews. Actually, in the case of Miriam, we have to get this from the Midrash, but both of them are married to people from Shevet Yehuda, whereas Moshe is married to a foreign woman, right, to Tzipporah, who is an outsider, not from the Ivrim. And you might wonder whether they're to some degree asking the question, like, what comes after us? When one day we and Moshe are no longer on earth, who's going to lead the people? And maybe most crucially, how is that leader going to maintain the same kind of connection to HaKadosh Baruch Hu that Moshe has, right? We need someone who can prophesy. We need someone who can give the law. And if it's not going to be Moshe, then who's it going to be? And it seems that Miriam and Aaron are somehow raising some issue in the lineage that will come from Moshe, right? It's whom did he marry? And is that part of the problem or part of the solution? Meaning, maybe are they saying, perhaps actually we're the family of prophets, right? Moshe is a prophet, Aaron is a prophet, Miriam is a prophetess. Perhaps we're the ones who become this kind of hereditary family of leaders, but it's not so clear that, Moshe is kind of married out, and maybe, although he is, of course, in charge, that maybe the line that comes from him is more questionable than what's going to come from Aaron or what's going to come from Miriam. So that's one kind of argument that they might be making, that they're concerned about, maybe whether Moshe has not put himself in the position to pass on a family tradition. On the other hand, you could say, is that the case? Or, is it the case that somehow they're talking about the Isha Kushit because there's some notion of the centrality or the importance of that Isha Kushit to the prophecy itself? And I mean, that's something I'm going to have to try to prove. It's less obvious. It's not clear in the text why that would be the case here. Although it's, we'll see there's a lot of evidence along that theme. But I think you have to consider both of these possibilities. I'm not sure, in a sense, we have to resolve the question of which is, where we're going for as far as the sense of what Miriam is saying. In favor of the idea that Miriam is kind of wondering whether maybe Aaron and she should be in charge, or not be in charge, but let's say their children should be in charge instead of Moshe's children. Weighing in that direction is that Miriam becomes Mitzorat, and Tarat is something that is associated throughout Tanakh with the arrogation of too much power or too many different kind of responsibilities in the religious political system to one person. So we see that perhaps in the case of Moshe himself, when he's Mitzorah at the burning bush, because he's going to be kind of both a king and a Kohen, right? He's going to be showing everyone how to do all the avodah and doing korbanot himself, slaughtering animals and sprinkling blood all over the place, etc. But he's also going to basically be a king. He's going to be a leader in war. He's going to be giving people the law and telling the people the rules. But going forward, we're going to make separation between those things. The king is not the Kohen. We have a kehunah that comes from Aaron, and it's a different thing than the kingship. And when you bring those things back together much later in Tanakh, with a little confusing, either Uzziah or Azariah, confusing because Uzziah and Azariah clearly are maybe on the one hand the same king because they have the same father and son, but I believe it's the case that when Uzziah as king is described as lighting the Ketoret in Beit HaMikdash and he becomes a Mitzorah, that the one who says he's a Mitzorah is Azariah, the Kohen Gadol, so it's very complexly interwoven there. But the same king is also sometimes called Azariah. In any case, you have this other instance where someone is trying to be both Kohen and king at the same time, and look, he's a Mitzorah. So maybe Miriam is becoming Mitzorat because this is about kind of being a little too grabby as far as political and religious responsibility and power and authority. However, for the rest of what we're discussing today, I'm interested in the possibility that at the same time, the whole notion of Moshe's nivu'ah, his prophecy, and what makes him the Navi that he is actually coming from his wife, or is connected to the person that he married. It's too strong to say coming from his wife, but what I mean is that the fact that he's married to Zipporah from Midian is centrally connected with the fact of Moshe's nivu'ah. And we can see that in a first layer just by looking at the narrative. Moshe runs away from Mitzrayim. He goes to Midian. He saves some daughters of Kohen Midian. Kohen Midian marries him to one of his daughters, and that kicks off Moshe's mission. He's going to live in Midian and work there, and eventually, as a shepherd working in Midian, he's going to hear Kadosh Baruch Hu speaking to him, and that starts the whole Moshe as the prophet and as the leader. So only with Midian do you get that, right? And then Moshe goes down to Mitzrayim. He brings everyone out of Mitzrayim, and where do they go back to? They go back to Har Sinai or Har Chorev, which is where he was before when he was shepherding for Midian. And whom should he meet there but Yitro, Kohen Midian, right? His relative-in-law, who is greeting him and talking to him about making systems of, let's say, Batei Din, essentially. He's talking about religious courts and the establishment of religious courts. And then suddenly at Har Sinai, we have this revelation, this great contact with Hashem. So right there at ground zero, so to speak, we have this association between Midian and the revelation at Sinai. Going back to Midian brings the people to Sinai, brings the people to Hashem for the receiving of the Torah in the style of Nevuah as, what Moshe brings, right? Because there's all sorts of Nevuah, but the Torah is the Nevuah of Moshe. Not only that, but in Parshat Behalotecha, another thing that happens, indeed, right before Moshe suddenly feels at a loss to provide the people for the first time with what they're demanding, is that seemingly maybe Moshe's in-law from Midian, and I'm being deliberately elliptical because I've heard it convincingly argued that it's not necessarily the case that Hoten means father-in-law, and maybe we're talking about like his brother-in-law. In any case, like a Kohen Midian, Chovav ben Reuel, Yitro, whomever we're talking about, comes to Moshe and says that he needs to go back to his land or his people, his kindred, his homeland, and Moshe tries to persuade him to stay. The Torah is not 100% explicit about whether or not he leaves, but on the theory that he does leave, suddenly Moshe feels at a very low ebb, right? Like when the people are making these demands, suddenly Moshe, it says, Ra beinav, it's bad in his eyes because he doesn't know how to get meat for them. And before, there was a different kind of matzav ruach for Moshe, right? Now, suddenly, when he's lost his contact with Midian to some degree, he is less able to deal as this prophetic leader. And maybe that crisis is also something that Miriam is talking about. In a sense, it might be that Moshe has lost contact with Midian, perhaps even with his wife. And that is related to the events that have preceded this moment where Miriam and Aaron are talking about what's going on with Moshe and the Isha Kushit. But that still doesn't explain the Isha Kushit, right? Because Midianite would be the appropriate word if we're talking about Tzipora. One last thing before we get to that, though, is that when you go all the way to the end of Moshe's life, it's notable that Moshe dying and the end of his Nevuah, the end of his prophecy, is associated with the war against Midian, where they wipe out not just Midian, but specifically Dafka, the Benot Midian. It's about the Benot Midian being the problem. And Moshe is angry when at first they come back and they don't wipe out the Benot Midian, even though he's married to a Bat Midian, right? The daughters of Midian are the ones who are involved in all this Avodah Zarah with Benot Moav, because of Barak ben Zippor and Bilaam ben Beor. And so you have this elaborate set of things associating Midian with Nevuah, right? That culminates in Moshe killing off Midian and Benot Midian specifically. And then it's, Moshe, it's time to die. The end of the Nevuah of Moshe, the end of the elaboration of the Torah through Moshe. So there's something from start to finish about, actually, in order to get verse by verse of the Torah from Moshe, seemingly he needs to have Midianite woman at his side. He needs to be hanging out with his Midianite relatives in the Midianite shepherding grounds near Har Sinai, all of that. And that is an arc of several different hints or suggestions throughout the Torah pointing in this direction. So now we turn to the question of, but how can that be the Isha Kushit? Because she's not Tzipora is not an Isha Kushit. She's an Isha Midianite. So it will help us to go back and look at when we first hear about Midian. Who is Midian? Midian is a son of Avraham Avinu. So we have in Sefer Bereshit, Perek Kaf Hei, starting with Pasuk Aleph, Vayosef Avraham Vayikach Isha Ushema Keturah. So Avraham married a woman named Keturah. The Midrash tells us that this is remarriage to Hagar. In any case, he has a wife after the death of Sarah Imenu. ותלדו את זמרן ואת יוקשן ואת מדן ואת מדיין ואת ישבק ואת שוח. ויוקשן ילד את שווה ואת דדן, ובני דדן היו אשורים ולטושים ולאומים. So this woman, Keturah, the wife of Abraham, bore him Zimran, Yokshan, Medan, Midian, Ishbak, Shuach, and then Yokshan had children, had Shva, had Dedan, and the sons of Dedan were Ashurim, which sounds like they were Assyrian, and Litushim and Leomim. That already is a first hint, because actually there's elsewhere a confusing issue with when it's talking about Nimrod. It seems like maybe on the one hand, Assyria comes from Shem. On the other hand, it seems like it comes from Cush. So that already maybe gives us Cush, but we're going to get something more direct than that. But in any case, we have Midian being mentioned alongside Didan. And that's the thing that you have to pick up on. Because we said before in Parshat Ba'alotecha, Eldad and Medad, that on its own was kind of like a, what's this dad thing? What does that have to do with it? Why are they're like, it's almost comical, right? It sounds like Tweedledee and Tweedledum or something. It's Torah is giving the names of two different people and making it kind of sound silly to call your attention to, they both have an ending to their name that's the same, but then they have, different beginnings. And these are these two people about whom you know nothing. You don't know what their prophecy was. You just know that they became prophets. So it's about the idea of acquisition of prophecy, and you have this term dad. So now you go over here and you notice Didan, which sounds like Midan and Midian, these different sons and grandchildren of Avraham Avinu. And now the funny thing is you pick up on Didan and you say, where else is there Didan? So if you now go and look and you say, where else does Didan get mentioned? When we're given the genealogy of Cush, it says, Uvnei Cush Sva Uhavila Usafta Ura'ama Usaftecha Uvnei Ra'ama Shva Udidan. Shva and Didan were just mentioned to us as the grandchildren of Avraham Avinu. But here, they are mentioned as the descendants of Cush. And then it's Vechush Yalad et Nimrod, Hu Echel Hiyot Gibor Ba'aretz. So now we start picking up on Cush being associated with Nimrod, and everything, it goes to Bavel. So this is something swirling around Avraham Avinu, that Avraham Avinu comes from the land of Nimrod, right? We have that in the Midrash, but he comes from Ur Kasdim. He's from around there. He's from this region around Bavel and Ashur, Babylon and Syria. And when we're being told about his children and grandchildren, Torah is taking the names that it's giving and it's mixing them together with the names of the children and grandchildren of Cush. And so it's actually saying there is something a little bit Cushite in something that comes from Avraham. And in that same list of what comes from Avraham, you also have Midian. So it's Midian is one of the sons of Avraham, and Didan is one of the grandchildren of Avraham. And also Shva is mentioned in both of those places. So it's Shva and Dedan are both grandchildren of Abraham and also grandchildren of Cush at the same time. So the Torah is saying, look at these things side by side. There's something about Midian and that whole set that come from Abraham where maybe we'd like to say, yeah, they're from Shem, they're descended from Abraham. There's something maybe a little bit more connected to Hashem, maybe a little more kasher about them. And maybe it's comforting that Moshe is marrying not just a random person, but someone who is coming from actually a shevet or a tribe or a nation that's descended from Abraham. But there's also a kind of a version of those same people. This reference to Dedan and Shva is telling us that's a little bit more Cushite, right? That it kind of turns into something more problematically foreign, like that comes from Ham instead of from Shem. And Mitzrayim is what comes from Ham. So we know, that starts to be, or Canaan also comes from Ham. Mitzrayim and Canaan are the emblems of what we want to get away from or what we need to destroy and extirpate and all of that. And so when you start saying Cush, that immediately is more problematic. But the point, I think, is we're talking about Tzipora in both cases. She is a Midianite, but there's something maybe a little bit too foreign and maybe too prone to Avodah Zarah or something like that. And so there's a version of understanding what Midian is where Midianite and Cushite are kind of the same thing. And that's what the Torah is hinting at by calling her an Isha Cushite. So that, in some sense, is just a textual thing to note that's a little bit interesting, that it connects the idea of Cush and Midian and explains why, Moshe would be described as marrying an Isha Cushite, but now it all makes sense. It can be the case that it's talking about Tzipora, and she's an Isha Cushite, and really that coheres. We're still talking about the same person. There are different directions we can go in from here. One of them, I think, I don't want to belabor, but I'll just mention in rapid fire, this Dalit thing, actually, we've just scratched the surface of. And there's a lot of other stuff that piles up in favor of the same theme that we're talking about. Because now you ask, where else does Dad appear? And I'm not sure it's 100% everything of where it appears, but it suddenly is about all of these things that indirectly connect to Midian or other descendants of Abraham that are not part of the nation. So there's I think a Hadad who's descended from Ishmael, and there's a Hadad who is descended from Esav or Edom. And when you look at Hadad, who's descended from Esav, what it says specifically about him is V'yamat Husham v'yimloch tachtav Hadad ben Bedad, another Dad word, Hamakeh et Midian b'sdeh Moav v'shem iro Awif. So we have in the genealogy of Edom, a mention of someone named Hadad. The Hadad comes up as more plays on words with another Bedad, and he struck Midian in the field of Moab. So we have Midian and Moab. It's not just a mention of Midian. It's a mention of Midian specifically in conjunction with Moab, which references the event at the end of Moshe's life with Balak ben Tzipor, like Tzipora, for example, who was a king of Moab, and Balaam ben Beor, where their scheme was to get Bnei Israel to go engage in Avodah Zarah with the daughters of Midian. So it's the daughters of Moab and Midian together, and here we have this mention of Midian and Moab together. So it's referencing again descent from Abraham, and at the same time also Midian and Moab, and it's all associated with this Dalit word. You also have, I think, an Adad mentioned elsewhere who's connected with Hadad. So that's just sort of repeating on the theme of saying, yeah, we have all sorts of people who have names with Dalit in them. And that's kind of this almost comical thread that runs through all of this. But it just goes on and on. I mean, then you look in Sefer Iyov, for example, there's Bildad Ashuchi, who's one of the people who comes to sort of comfort or excoriate Eov. And who is he there with? Eliphaz HaTemani. Eliphaz HaTemani. So Eliphaz and Teman, we're now talking about other descendants of Abraham, right? Eliphaz, for example, I think is the son of Esav and the father of Amalek. And you have Bildad Hashuchi, and then on the other side you have Tzofar Hanaamati. And Tzofar is like Tzipor, so that's Tzipor, like Balak ben Tzipor, or Tzipora, the wife of Moshe. So it just is this big solar system of all of these Dalit words associated with descent from Abraham, associated with the acquisition of prophecy, associated with the problematic relationship possibly to Midian and Moab that Moshe finally deals with at the end of his life by wiping out the Benot Midian. And that is best pulled together by this noting that Didan is the descendant of Abraham mentioned along with Midian, but Didan also is the descendant of Abraham, is the descendant of Cush. That explains why Tzipora is being called a Cushite woman, an Isha Cushite. So now this is a lot of data to lay out. Now the question is, what do you do with all of this? What is the point of it? Like, how does it make us better of Hashem? What do we learn from it? Because at the moment, it just seems like, okay, fine. It is acceptable to call Tzipora Cushite, but why would Miriam and Aaron be talking about that? And why is it an issue? And why is it interesting? And in some sense, I think it might be that you can think of it as just a different strand of evidence in support of something that you could build up from the more basic point, which is that Midian is descended from Abraham, and that Moshe really was enabled in his nivu'ah, and specifically enabled in his ability to bring the nation to receive the Torah at Sinai by his connection, his family connection to Midian. And Miriam and Aaron may be talking about the family connection as though it's kind of something a bit uglier. By calling it a connection to Cush, they're maybe referencing that there's something on the borderline of problematic. This could turn into Avodah Zarah, which indeed it does in the next generation, right, when you go 40 years later. So they're pointing out something that's problematic about it, but in any case, Midian definitely seems to be part of Moshe's story and how he becomes the Navi that he is, how he gets the relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu that he gets, and why it might have taken a little wind out of his sails when maybe Yitro or Chovav ben Reuel, or whichever in-law of his from Midian leaves, possibly with Moshe's wife, and goes back to Midian. So then what do we make of that? Well, there's another thing that we could bring in here, which is that Rashi famously said about Abraham that there is a puzzlingly creepy or scary comment made about this statement that Abraham gave the children of Keturah matanot. ולבני הפילגשים אשר לאברהם נתן אברהם מתנות וישלחם מעל יצחק בנו בעודנו חי קדמה אל ארץ קדם. So for the sons of the concubines, Abraham gave gifts and sent them away from Yitzchak his son while he yet lived eastward to the east country. And what Rashi says about these matanot, these gifts, is that he taught them kshufim, he taught them magic, which sounds very strange, because what was Abraham doing teaching sorcery, first of all? And second of all, why would he teach that to seemingly the children that are not, the inheritors of his whole legacy? Like, if, Yitzchak, it seems not nice to say, but isn't Yitzchak the important one? If you were going to hand out, special gifts, why wouldn't you give that to Yitzchak? And what is he doing in any case, teaching what sounds like forbidden sorcery to your other children? Like, doesn't he want Avodat Hashem to spread through the world in general? And I think the resolution of this comes from this whole idea of Midian, Cush, and then sort of resonating back and forth between those two different perspectives on one thing. I think the point is that this whole idea of nivuah of the sort that Moshe is capable of, that is not something that it's so easy to distinguish from what you would call sorcery, right? Moshe is turning a stick into a serpent. The sorcerers in Mitzrayim also can turn sticks into reptiles. The Torah is telling us that a lot of stuff that Moshe is doing, someone could look at it and say, oh, you're a very powerful sorcerer. Like they could miss the point that there's something different about Moshe, that what he's doing is just bearing a message from Hashem, and Hashem can do whatever he wants, however supernatural seeming. And that's not the same thing as someone saying, I have an idol in my pocket and it gives me great power and let me show you my magical power. But on the surface, showing people things they don't expect, it sounds like parlor tricks, right? So the Torah is admitting there's something borderline sorcery-like in what Moshe is doing. And where did he learn to do this? He was shepherding a flock for his Midianite relatives when that all started. So this idea that Avram taught sorcery to his other children, I think the point is more, what did it become in their hands? Avram was a Navi. Avram had found HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Avram understood how to have a dialogue with Borei Olam. And he wanted to teach his family what he knew about that. His first son was named Yishmael, right? He will hear God. So we know about Abraham that he has this as a goal. He teaches what he can teach. And in the hands of Yitzchak, and then in Yaakov, and down through Bnei Israel, up to the point where I want to suggest maybe it was a bit forgotten or lost, you have something that ideally remains part of Avodat Hashem and part of one's relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. In the hands of nations that are going to go off their own way, and they're going to each in their way kind of roll down the slippery slope of idolatry, something that was a way of talking to Hashem becomes a way of doing sorcery and engaging in idolatrous practices. But the point is, there was something that reconnected when Moshe went to Midian. Moshe found Midian running away from Mitzrayim, and there he came into contact with some kind of Masoret from Avraham Avinu, where he was able to learn how to talk with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, because there was some kind of understanding of how to talk to HaKadosh Baruch Hu that Avraham had gained, which he had taught to his son Midian, which remained part of the Masoret of the nation of Midian that came from him. And yes, that is a dangerous thing, because in one generation, Midian is helping Moshe to bring the Torah to Am Yisrael, and 40 years later, Moshe is waging war against Midian because Midian and Moab together are trying to tempt Bnei Yisrael into Avodah Zarah. And that exactly is this knife's edge thing of, is it Midian or is it Cush, right? Is Dedan a nephew of Midian, or is Dedan a grandson of Cush? And the same with Shva, right? That you can ask the same kind of question, because Shva and Dedan, come as a pair in those passages. So going back to Eldad and Medad and where we started, I think the point is that this whole sequence of events in Parshat Ba'alotecha can be read as a discussion of where the capacity for nivuah comes from. And we see ample evidence in the Torah that this is, to some degree, a method that can be passed from generation to generation and can be learned and can be understood. And also that it's highly radioactive material, so to speak, that it can easily turn into the wrong thing. It can easily become a method of Avodah Zarah. It may not be so easily distinguishable from that. That it may not be so different mechanically than things that seem in the hands of Ovdei Kochavim, like they are, just practices of pagan sorcery and idolatry. But that with a proper methodology from the Masoret of Abraham, and with the proper attitude, the proper kavanah, where you're seeking Hashem and you're finding Him and He's responding to you, it becomes something that Moshe can rekindle and discover within the nation of Israel because of this reconnection to a tradition of Abraham's that went out into another nation that came from Abraham that ultimately is not going to stay on the right path. They're going to meet their end at the end of the Torah on the wrong side of the fence because they become a tool in the hands of Balak and Balaam in trying to tempt Bnei Israel into idolatry. But I think in closing, the point that's interesting is it makes sense that this would have been the way to get them, right? Like we think of it as an extraneous or arbitrary detail that it's Benot Moab and Midian who end up getting Bnei Israel to engage in Avodah Zarah, and therefore to get punished. But if Moshe married a Bat Midian, what that demonstrates to you is that there's a way of relating, so to speak, to marriage to Midian that was close enough to kasher that it was something that Moshe could do and it could have a productive result. So that was what Bilam cleverly presented to Bnei Israel, this thing that was, maybe, perhaps you'd like to engage in prophecy, perhaps you'd like to learn the arts of prophecy so that you can talk to Hashem. And that can start the right way and it can end the wrong way, and it can turn into Avodah Zarah led by Benot Midian. So in closing, I don't think that this line of evidence demonstrates to us what the method of Nivuah is, but it does suggest, in a sense, it is a teachable method that Avraham discovered and that made it to Moshe through Midian, and that has incredible slippery slopes around it, or incredible dangers that could lead to improper kavanah and the wrong relationship to a Kadosh Baruch Hu, which means really a relationship to idolatry instead, which means this is not something to be taken lightly, and that in a sense explains everything Yehoshua, Miriam, and Aaron were saying, because Miriam and Aaron were saying, what's going on with this Isha Kushit that he's married? They're emphasizing the danger of idolatry in Moshe's marriage to a Midianite, or when Eldad and Medad, who have these double dalits in their name, are engaging in Nivuah, Yehoshua is saying, maybe we should lock them up. Why is he so concerned, right? Why does he want to lock them up? It's a little more understandable if it's not so clear whether what they're doing is kasher. And Moshe says, no, it's fine, everyone should become a prophet. But that could be a mistake of Moshe's, in a sense. It could be that he had to learn the necessity of ridding Bnei Israel of that relationship with Benot Midian through war, and sort of learn it the hard way. And at the end of his life, and after he'd been told he can't go into the land, and perhaps for reasons related to this as well.
We would like to encourage our viewers to share these videos with friends and send in your responses. If you would like to obtain Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael or invite the rabbi for a speaking engagement, please email us at office@machonshilo.org.